So when I was a graduate student, actually before I went to MIT, I was at Imperial College, and I started reading, even before I went there, I started reading Norbert Wiener's book on cybernetics. And also I started, there was a little book called Automata Studies that was published in 1956. And it had in it stuff about neural networks and about von Neumann and other mathematicians who had ideas about the brain. And that triggered my interest in things. So I actually read The Laws of Thought, for example.
Okay.
And then I read McCulloch and Pitts' work on neural networks that implemented Boolean algebra and stuff like that. So I was primed, and I came across this piece of work by the mathematician John von Neumann on how you build reliable computers from unreliable elements. And it struck me that there were other ways to do that than what von Neumann had done. And I ended up working on that at MIT, encouraged by my supervisor, who was McCulloch. In fact, I went from working with under the supervision in part of Dennis Gabor, the inventor of holography, who was at Imperial College in the 50s and 60s and 70s. He had been a high school classmate of von Neumann and Eugene Wigner, the physicist, in Budapest when they were all kids.
Yeah.
Part of the amazing group of Hungarian scientists who left Budapest. And in fact, in the first month I was there, I raised, in those days, I raised $1 million very quickly to build up the Committee on Mathematical Biology there. In today's dollars, that would be something like 20 million. And it was easy. It was much easier in those days. This was 1967 to do that. And 5 years later, I ended up working with a very, very smart postdoctoral fellow, Hugh Wilson, and we produced what are now known as the Wilson-Cowan equations, which captured, in using differential equations rather than Boolean algebra, the essential structure of large-scale brain activity. There was, for many years, a very distinguished neurologist at University of Chicago, from Vienna, I think he was originally, Heinrich Klüver. And he, in the 1920s, had made a study of what happens when you take peyote. And the story goes that when he started to take the substance, he told one of his colleagues to come to his lab to make sure he was okay. And he found Heinrich on the floor. He'd passed out. He'd taken too much of the stuff. And finally, he refined the dose down to the level where he didn't pass out, he could stay awake, and after the initial period of vomiting, he began to see all these patterns, and he classified the patterns that he saw into 4 different classes of patterns. I had an extremely bright graduate student named Bard Ermentrout join me in the late 70s, and I realized that there was an analogy between the pattern formation that occurs in brain activity and the pattern formation that occurs in physical problems like, for example, what is called Rayleigh-Bénard convection patterns. If you heat a liquid from below, in a saucepan, for example, a fairly viscous liquid, and you study it before it starts boiling at high temperatures, it actually starts generating convection patterns. The liquid at the bottom of the container gets hot, so it gets lighter, so it rises to the top. But at the top, it cools again, so it gets heavier, so it falls down again. But if you look down on the liquid, it rises and falls. There's a kind of wall of water that's rising, and then there's another wall that's falling, and you get convection patterns. And that's essentially what generates cloud patterns in the upper atmosphere. Anyway, if you look down on it, and sometimes you see hexagonal patterns of rising and falling liquid, or sometimes concentric circular patterns called roll patterns. And I realized there was a neural analog of that, and that we should see spontaneous pattern formation in brain dynamics under certain conditions, where the balance between excitation and inhibition is broken so that there's not enough inhibition to control excitation, so the system will go unstable in patterns. And it turned out there's ultimately, it took me 30 years, but we found a way of writing down equations that incorporated some of the facts that accumulated over from 1960 onward about the functional architecture of the visual brain and the ability of the visual brain to detect edges in the visual world and things like that. And it turned out we could produce all the different classes of hallucinatory images that Cleaver reported and classified. He had 4 classes. We found a mathematical theorem that told us that there were only 4 kinds of patterns that the nervous system could make because of the way it was wired. Mm-hmm. And they corresponded precisely to the 4 classes of patterns classified by Henry Cleaver, which humans have been seeing for at least 50,000 years. If you look at cave art, a large fraction of cave art corresponds to these kinds of patterns, periodic blob patterns, zigzag line patterns, all sorts of things, either on caves or what's called mobile art, carvings on rocks. For example, there's a rock carving from 70,000 before the present from southwest Africa, which is full of zigzag patterns. And if you go into the caves, you've got lots and lots of things like periodic blob patterns, for example, combined with pictures of horses, things like that. The anthropologist that I corresponded with, David Lewis Williams, particularly from South Africa, he claims that these patterns are not, these paintings are not totally representational, but that they're metaphorical. Mm-hmm. They have to do with the ancient, very old initial beliefs about spirits and all sorts of things that. But so the cave art is a valuable source of hallucinatory images. You find lots and lots of spirals and periodic patterns, things like that. And it turns out they are precisely among the classes of imagery that the cortex, by virtue of its structure and the way it's connected, can make. Claude Shannon was really interesting. First time I met him was at a little faculty-student picnic in Arlington near Boston. And he was out on the little lake, and he was walking with a large piece of wood floating on the surface. So he was walking on water, basically. And then the next thing I saw, he was riding on a unicycle. And so he had all kinds of interesting hobbies and things like that. He was really a very unique person and very, very clever. And I mean, it was. I mean, I couldn't have had a better star than to have an education from Gabor, the inventor of holography, McCulloch Pitts, who started automata theory, Shannon, who started information theory, and Wiener, who started cybernetics and filtering, all kinds of stuff. I mean, so a few years ago, I gave a colloquium at MIT, and my friend Tommy Paggio introduced me as one of the last living relics of the golden age of MIT, and it was true. It was the golden age. People make a lot out of the golden age, like Woody Allen's movie Midnight in Paris, for example, is all about golden ages and the delusion that life was always better in the past in a golden age. But MIT was really something in the 50s and 60s. It still is, but it's very different from what it was then. longer. I mean, the experience of the artificial intelligence community is quite sobering. 50 years ago, people thought that they were going to be able to solve problems like machine translation of language and computer vision and stuff like that very quickly. And it turned out these problems are far, far more complicated than people originally thought. The things that we take for granted are actually things that are very difficult for machines to do. And so there's a recent book by Walter Isaacson that I thought was very, very interesting called The Inventors, I think, or something like. It's all about the growth of the internet and the modern world and everything. And I think he's got the right idea. He said that in the early days, people didn't think about artificial intelligences as being autonomous robots, but as aids to humans. And he noted I thought was very interesting, he noted that all these big blue machines and the others that play chess, that it's true they've beaten humans to playing chess, but he said when you have a machine compete with a human who's aided by a machine, the human plus artificial intelligence always seems to beat a machine working on its own. That humans have the ability to have insights and original ideas and things like that don't seem to be easily come by in robots so far. And so he thinks the original sense that the early pioneers had that these machines would be aids to human understanding and creativity, rather than autonomous robots, still seems like the right way to go, rather than so all these remarks by Hawking and others about how dangerous the world is going to be if robots become autonomous, truly, I think they're misplaced. I think they'll be enormous aids to humans, but I don't think it's going to go the other way.